The Houston Texans are off to an impressive 4-1 start, but with this impressive start has still been a couple of questions. So in today's video, I want to answer the question of how good are the Houston Texans? So as I mentioned, we are going to be talking about the Houston Texans and deciphering how good this team actually is. And we are going to be doing so by briefly covering the 5 games that they have played, and then afterwards we'll talk about the rest of their schedule and what this team's ceiling truly can be. But if you guys do go on to enjoy the video, go ahead and hit the like and subscribe button. I would greatly appreciate that. And with that said, let's get into the video. So as I mentioned, we are going to begin by talking about what this team has done through the first 5 weeks of the NFL season. They are 4-1 and have some very impressive victories over the likes of the Jacksonville Jaguars, Buffalo Bills, Colts, and Bears. But they do have one loss in there that was kind of a bit of a stinker versus the Minnesota Vikings. Let's go ahead and begin by just briefly covering some of the stats, because I think that does tell a big story that we need to talk about. Offensively speaking, they are averaging 20.4 points per game, which is the 19th best in the NFL. They average 376.6 yards per game, which is the 6th best in the NFL. They average 2 touchdowns a game, which is the 20th best in the NFL. However, interestingly enough, this team passed the ball on 61.19% of plays, which is the 9th highest in the NFL, whereas they run the ball 38.81% of the time, which is the 24th best in the NFL. Sticking with the run game here, because this will be something that I detail in pretty extensive detail here on this video, they're averaging 4 yards per rush, which is the 23rd best in the NFL. They're averaging 0.6 touchdowns per game, running the football, which is the 20th best in the NFL, and every single rushing statistic, at least on this website, has them below 20th to around 25th in the league. Now we move over to the defensive side of the ball, where they're averaging 22.8 opponents per game, which is the 17th best in the NFL, 274.2 yards per game allowed, which is the 4th best in the NFL, and they average 2.6 opponents touchdowns per game, which is the 20th best in the NFL. Now, one thing I will say is these statistics are a tad bit skewed because of that Minnesota loss. If you look at every single one of their games, they have, for the most part, kept their opponents in check, especially defensively, outside of that Minnesota game where they gave up their highest scoring output, which was 34. But outside of that, you gave up 27 to Indianapolis, 13 to Chicago, 20 and 20 to Buffalo and Jacksonville. So take that as you will. And usually when we're talking about a defense, you usually will see certain statistics be slightly raised over another, because that's how you would attack a defense. But that hasn't really been the case with this team. Teams are averaging passing plays on 56% of the time, whereas they're running the football around 44% of the time, which is a pretty normal statistic. Again, sometimes you'll see teams have like an 80% pass rate because their secondary is really weak, but that isn't the case for this Texans defense. Now, if we look at the individual games for the Houston Texans, I would say that they've gone kind of how I expected it to go. If you were to ask me through the first 5 weeks of the NFL season what I would have predicted this Texans record to be, I probably would have said something like 4-1 or 3-2 coming into the season, because of how much respect I do have for this Texans team, and because their schedule hasn't been terribly difficult. Minnesota has obviously panned out to be one of the best teams in the NFL, but outside of that, you had 3 relatively easy matchups, and then obviously that really difficult matchup with the Buffalo Bills. But outside of that, you've had 3 relatively easy games: Indianapolis, Chicago, and especially Jacksonville, which has turned out to be a really bad team. Regardless of that, these games still have been relatively competitive, which doesn't really tell me a whole lot. I do think there are certain things that this team would have liked to have done better within these 5 games. Again, pretty easy schedule. Stroud has looked good. The run game hasn't looked as good. And I think one of the biggest complaints I've been seeing from Texans fans is that Bobby Slowick hasn't been running the football effectively and hasn't really been doing too well as a play caller. But I do want to kind of defend him here for a second. This is an offense that really relies on the run game. I'm not saying they don't rely on Stroud and their great receivers, but when you don't have a good run game, it's really difficult to have a good passing offense. I think it's no coincidence that in week 1, Joe Mixon ran the ball like 30 times for over 150 yards. Not saying that they want Joe Mixon to run the ball 30 times a game, but when you don't have your catalyst in that running department, it's going to be very difficult to have an effective offense. These past 4 weeks, their number 1 running back has been Cam Akers, who is just not a very good running back. So in defense of Bobby Slowick, he has been relying on bad running backs and having to put the ball a whole lot more into CJ Stroud's hand, and it's going to be harder for CJ Stroud to really be effective when there isn't really that threat of having a run game. Because when you have no run game, there is no threat in the RPO game, there is no threat in the play action game, which is a huge part of this Texans offense. So instead, you're seeing CJ Stroud do a whole lot more of just dropping back and having to read defenses, which Stroud is very capable of doing so. Obviously, this team is 4-1, so they're doing fine, but that isn't really what this team wants to do, at least not a ton. Obviously, throughout the game, they are going to have Stroud drop back and read defenses like a normal quarterback would, but the play action, RPOs, everything that comes from the run game is a whole lot harder to do when you don't have that number one running back. And hell, they haven't even had their number two running back in Dameon Pierce, so they've been missing their starter and their backup, so they've been working with two third and fourth string guys who just aren't that good. Yet despite that, this team has still managed to actually be 4-1, has beaten a damn good Buffalo team, and sure, that loss to Minnesota sucked, but you've done pretty well in the absence of Joe Mixon. Again, when we're talking about not having Joe Mixon had 159 yards in week 1, and since then, their highest rusher has been Cam Akers in week 4 with 53 yards. So because this team doesn't have a running threat, they've had to put a whole lot more pressure on CJ Stroud. But I imagine once Joe Mixon does come back, that's going to take at least a little bit of relief off of CJ Stroud and this offense, because they're going to be able to do things like run RPOs, do play actions, and effectively run the football because you have a good running back. Now, yes, the offensive line still has to perform better. I think the interior has very much struggled to run the football. But again, you could maybe point to a couple different things regarding why they've been somewhat struggling, and that is because there is no consistency with the offense right now. As an offensive lineman, one thing that you're really going to need is that consistent offensive flow. It's going to be very difficult for a offensive lineman to have a game plan in week 1 where everything is downhill, everything is a run first offense, and then all of a sudden now you're having to do a whole lot more pass blocking, which is exhausting for especially interior offensive linemen. And so when you're trying to run the ball with a bad running back, it just isn't going to be as effective because of the inconsistencies with the offense and because you actually don't have a good running back. So when Joe Mixon does come back, I'm not going to say the interior offensive line is just magically going to become better, but I do think it will definitely help and maybe push them to be a tad bit more effective. Outside of that, I don't think the offensive line has been particularly bad. I just think this offense has felt like it's been missing something, and I think that thing they're missing is their star running back who can help this team actually run the football. Once this team gets that element back, I think this offense should look even better because the three wide receivers in Dell, Diggs, and Collins has been really good and really effective. Nico Collins, hell, he might be one of the best receivers in the NFL, which is really awesome to say. So they have that passing game down. It's just missing that element of surprise with the running game and all that other stuff that I've been talking about. So once they get that stuff, I think this passing game can also take another step forward, which will make this offense that much more scary and that much more effective. Again, Slowick's been getting a lot of heat and a lot of criticism from Texans fans, but I don't think they're taking into account that they're missing one of their main catalysts on the offensive end in Joe Mixon. So in my personal opinion, to be 4-1 without your star running back and to have some really good wins against some really good teams, I think it's been very impressive, and I think it's a bit of a testament to CJ Stroud and how good he is at operating the offense without even having the option to do play actions and RPOs. But we've talked about all the games and we've talked about what's been going on with the offense. We could talk about the defense. I don't think there's been too much to really talk there. I think everything in the statistics kind of tells a story. This defense has been really good. I wouldn't say they've been great. I've had some people kind of push back on that idea that they haven't been great. I think they've had some great moments, but it still hasn't been fully great yet, which kind of is in rhythm with their offense, where I think the offense has been good but not great, and that's simply because they haven't had that threat of the run game. I think for this defense, they can be great, but it might just be getting Joe Mixon back and helping them win more time of possession will, help the defense out even more. Defensively speaking, they've been fine. They have a really good pass rusher. They have some really good cornerbacks. The secondary has been solid. Linebackers have played well. Nothing is bad about this defense. It's a really solid unit all around that has the potential to be really freaking awesome. I just think, once they get Joe Mixon back, I want to see this team at full strength, and then potentially we can start to see this team dominate teams and look a whole lot better in their victories. But looking towards the future of this upcoming season, they have a pretty easy schedule for the most part. Their next 4 weeks of of games. They have some tough matchups sprinkled in there, but I think this Texans team is better than basically every single one of these teams. Next week, they have the New England Patriots. I would be absolutely stunned if they were to lose that game. Then they have the Green Bay Packers, which is going to be a very fun matchup. Jordan Love of that offense hasn't quite yet got it going 100%, but it does look like they're starting to kind of put the pieces together. That's not going to be an easy game, but I think that it is a winnable game for you guys. Then you got Indianapolis at home. Again, Indianapolis always plays you guys pretty tough, but I do think that you are the more talented team, and we'll see about the status of Anthony Richardson for that game. Then you have a 3-game stretch that is actually quite difficult. First, you have the New York Jets without Robert Saleh, who just got fired as of when I'm making this video. I don't think that's a good idea for the Jets, but they did that, and so yeah. This is a tough one to predict. The Jets offense hasn't looked good, and I expect this defense to probably take a step back without Robert Saleh there, so I think Texans could probably win that matchup too. Then you got another NFC North matchup with the Detroit Lions. That's a tough game, but it's a winnable game. It's a game that could go either way. I'll say 50-50 shot there. Then you have the Dallas Cowboys on Monday Night Football. That's going to be an awesome game, obviously. Two Texas teams, not really a rivalry, but maybe a brewing rivalry. We'll have to wait and see. This is the first time Dallas has versed Houston, where both teams are pretty good, so I think this is going to be a really fun matchup. I would definitely favor Houston, though. Then you have a 3-game stretch that on paper is pretty easy with the Titans, Jacksonville Jaguars, and Miami Dolphins. I do expect Miami to have Tua by then, so that's definitely not going to be a give me game. That should definitely be a bit more difficult, but I think you're the better team, so you should be able to win all 3 of those games. And then to end the season off, you have Kansas City, Baltimore, and Tennessee. Obviously, Kansas City and Baltimore, those games are going to have huge implications potentially for the AFC playoff race, so those games could be absolutely massive. And in terms of saying whether I think they'll win or lose, I have really no clue. Those two teams in Baltimore and Kansas City are really good, so it's really hard to say if they'll win those games. Right now, I would probably favor Kansas City and Baltimore, but we'll have to wait to see how those teams are playing when we get closer to that game. So when it comes down to it, I think this is a really good Houston Texans team. I would probably say they're the 3rd best team in the AFC behind the aforementioned Chiefs and the Baltimore Ravens. I'd probably say Houston is right behind them, but I do think with Joe Mixon coming back, this offense can play even better. I think when this offense can get in better rhythm with the run game, with the play action game, and when this defense can not necessarily have to be the main focal point of this team, where they can rely a bit more on the offense, running the time of possession with Joe Mixon, using CJ Stroud's ability to throw the football. And I think when everything comes together, this can easily be one of the best teams in the entire NFL. The way I look at it, though, is that it's hard to doubt Kansas City, even if they start to stumble throughout the season. That Kansas City Chiefs team just knows how to win games, and it will be very difficult for the Texans to beat them, but I think they definitely could. And then for Baltimore, I know Baltimore has a couple question marks defensively, but that offense with Derrick Henry and Lamar Jackson might be one of the most scariest things I've ever seen. So it's really hard to doubt a team like Baltimore and predict a team like Houston to jump them. But outside of them, I think Houston is clearly in the lead for their division. I also think Houston is probably one of the best teams in the entire conference, so it should be very interesting to see where Houston ends up. Right now, if I had to guess, I would say they're going to make the playoffs and probably going to make a very deep playoff run. I just don't know quite yet if I would consider them to be like a Super Bowl favorite. But you guys let me know in the comment section below, and if you guys enjoyed the video, make sure you hit the like and subscribe button, and I love you guys. Peace.